My mother wanted me to go to prison for my golden child brother. I sent her instead. My brother Kevin was always the golden child, even though he was 28 and still lived in our mother's basement playing video games all day. I was 26 and worked as a radiologic technician at the hospital while going to night school for my bachelor's degree. My mother called Kevin her baby and said he was too sensitive for the real world. She paid all his bills and cooked his meals and did his laundry while he sat around getting high with his loser friends. I'd moved out at 18 because my mother said I was tough enough to take care of myself. She was right, but it still hurt that Kevin got everything handed to him while I worked doubles to pay rent. My mother would brag to her friends about Kevin's potential and how smart he was while barely mentioning that I existed. If I complained, she'd say Kevin needed more support because life was harder for him. Life was hard for him because he'd never held a job longer than a week. The police showed up at my apartment at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. They said they had a warrant for my arrest for embezzlement from Coleman Electronics, where I'd supposedly worked as a bookkeeper. I'd never worked there and told them that. They checked my ID and realized they had the wrong person. They were looking for Kay's Walsh at my address, but I was Katie Walsh and had never been Kevin Walsh. That's when I realized what happened. Kevin had used my apartment address and a version of my name when he got hired at Coleman. He'd stolen $40,000 over 6 months by writing checks to himself and cashing them. The detective said they'd be arresting Kevin Walsh once they found the right one. I knew exactly where he was, but didn't say anything yet. My mother called me an hour later, screaming. She said the police were at her house with a warrant for Kevin. She demanded that I come over immediately. When I got there, Kevin was in handcuffs in the back of a police car, and my mother was crying on the lawn. She grabbed me and said I needed to fix this. She said I needed to tell the police it was me, not Kevin. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. My mother said Kevin couldn't survive in prison, and I was stronger. She said I could handle it, but Kevin would die in there. She actually used those words. I told her Kevin stole $40,000, and she said that wasn't important. She said money could be replaced, but Kevin couldn't. She said I owed her for all the years she raised me, and this was how I could pay her back. I walked away, and she followed me to my car, screaming that I was selfish and heartless. The next day, my mother came to my job at the hospital. She told my supervisor I was having a family emergency and needed to leave. My supervisor let me go, and my mother dragged me to her lawyer's office. The lawyer's name was Bernard, and he looked uncomfortable when my mother explained her plan. She wanted me to confess to the embezzlement and say Kevin was innocent. She wanted me to say I used his name because I was jealous of him. Bernard said that would be perjury, and he couldn't help with that. My mother fired him on the spot and said she'd find a lawyer who cared about family. She tried 3 more lawyers that week, and they all said no. My mother then decided she didn't need lawyers. She went to Coleman Electronics herself and told them I was the real thief. She said Kevin was covering for me because he was a good brother. The problem was that Coleman had Kevin on their security cameras taking the money. They had his signature on the checks. They had witnesses who worked with Kevin, not me. The manager actually called me to apologize for my mother's behavior and said they knew I wasn't involved. My mother didn't stop. She called the prosecutor's office and said I'd threatened Kevin into taking the blame. The prosecutor asked for evidence, and my mother said she didn't need evidence because she was his mother and knew the truth. My mother started telling everyone in town that I was the real criminal. She told her church and the grocery store clerks. The problem was that everyone knew Kevin. They knew he'd been arrested 6 times before for petty theft and drug possession. They knew he'd been fired from every job for stealing. They knew I'd been working at the hospital since I graduated and had perfect references. Her hairdresser actually told her to stop lying about me or find a new salon. That's when my mother went nuclear. She showed up at my apartment at 11 that night. I heard the pounding first, then the screaming. My mother's voice carried through the door and probably down the entire hallway. She was yelling that I was killing Kevin, that I was selfish, that I was destroying our family. I stood on the other side of the door with my hand on the deadbolt, frozen. She kept pounding and screaming, saying she'd never forgive me if Kevin went to prison. She said I was heartless and cruel, and everyone would know what kind of daughter I really was. My neighbor across the hall opened his door and told her to leave or he'd call the cops. She screamed at him too, but eventually I heard her footsteps going down the stairs. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, my bank called. The manager asked if I'd been in that morning trying to access my accounts. I said no, and she explained that my mother had come in claiming she was me and needed to withdraw money for legal fees. The manager remembered my mother from when I was a kid, and she used to bring me in to deposit birthday money. She refused the withdrawal and wanted to warn me. I thanked her and hung up, then immediately went online and changed every password I had. I updated all my security questions to things my mother couldn't possibly know. My hands were shaking so hard I kept mistyping. 2 days later, Detective Robertson called and asked me to come down to the station. My mother had filed a police report claiming I'd threatened her and Kevin. She told them I said I'd frame Kevin for crimes I committed because I was jealous of him. I I brought everything with me to the station. My work schedule showing I was at the hospital during the times Kevin was at Coleman Electronics. My tax returns. My employment records. Detective Robertson looked through it all and then looked at me with something like pity. He said my mother seemed unstable and I should document everything she did from now on. He said to keep records of every call, every visit, every attempt to contact me. I left feeling sick. Leah found me crying in the break room at work the next day. She sat down and didn't say anything for a while, just handed me tissues. When I finally told her everything, she said her cousin was a lawyer and I should talk to him. She made the call right there and set up an appointment for me that afternoon. Brandon Starr's office was small but clean, and he listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he said my mother's behavior could get worse. He said desperate people do desperate things, and I should freeze my credit immediately. He told me to prepare for the possibility of needing a restraining order. He said it like it was inevitable, not just a maybe. I was at work 3 days later when Whitney called me into her office. She looked uncomfortable, kept straightening papers on her desk that didn't need straightening. She said my mother had called claiming I was stealing medications. She said my mother told her I was having mental health problems and someone needed to check on me. Whitney made it clear she didn't believe any of it, but she had to document the complaint. That's when I started crying. Not quiet tears, but the kind of sobbing where you can't breathe right. Whitney came around her desk and put her hand on my shoulder. She said she knew my mother was lying, that everyone who worked with me knew I was solid. But I realized right then that my mother would actually try to destroy my career to save Kevin. She would take everything from me if it meant he stayed out of prison. Anita from HR called me 2 days later. My mother had phoned the hospital 3 more times with increasingly wild stories. She claimed I was selling drugs. She said I was falsifying patient records. She said I was having an affair with a married doctor. None of it was true and none of it even made sense. But Anita said the hospital was considering a formal trespass warning. She asked if I was safe at home. I said yes because I lived alone, but I admitted I was scared of what my mother might do next. Anita connected me with the hospital's employee assistance program and gave me a number to call. I checked my email that night and found messages from 2 of my night school professors. Both said my mother had contacted them claiming I was having a breakdown and needed medical leave. Both sounded concerned and wanted to know if I was okay. I had to write back and explain that my mother was harassing me, that none of it was true, that I was sorry they got dragged into my family problems. It was humiliating. I called Brandon and told him about the professors. He said the pattern of interference was building a strong case for harassment charges if we needed to go that route. The next week, Detective Robertson called again. Kevin's public defender had reached out through him because my mother kept showing up at the defender's office. She was demanding he blame me instead of Kevin, insisting I was the real criminal. The defender told Detective Robertson that my mother was actually hurting Kevin's case because she wouldn't let him take a reasonable plea deal. He said Kevin had admitted everything privately, but my mother kept interfering. Detective Robertson said the defender seemed genuinely sorry about my situation. I thanked him and hung up, wondering if Kevin even knew what our mother was doing. My landlord called me at work. He sounded apologetic but said he needed to tell me that my mother had been calling him. She claimed I was subletting illegally and dealing drugs from my apartment. He said he knew it wasn't true, that I'd been a model tenant for 3 years. But he was documenting her calls in case things got worse. He called her clearly unwell, which was kind. I was just exhausted. Every day brought a new false accusation, a new person I had to explain things to, a new way my mother tried to destroy my life. Brandon helped me file for a restraining order the following Monday. My mother had shown up at the hospital again, waiting by my car in the parking lot. She followed me screaming about how I was killing Kevin, how I was a terrible daughter, how she wished I'd never been born. Security had to escort her off the property. I had documentation of everything now. The bank attempt, the false police report, the harassment at my job, witness statements from Whitney, Anita, my landlord, and the security guards. The judge granted a temporary restraining order and scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks out. I felt guilty, but I also felt relief for the first time in weeks. I woke up at 6 in the morning to someone pounding on my building's main door. I looked out my window and saw my mother standing on the sidewalk staring up at my apartment. She'd violated the restraining order 2 days after it was granted. I called the police and stayed inside while she screamed about how I was killing Kevin and destroying our family. The cops arrived within 15 minutes and served her with a violation notice right there on the street. She cried and told them I was lying about everything, that she was just a mother trying to protect her son. One of the officers looked uncomfortable, but they still gave her the paperwork and told her she'd face charges if she came back. After they left, I sat on my couch shaking because I realized my mother was so focused on saving Kevin that she couldn't see she was destroying herself. Detective Robertson called me that afternoon to check in, and I told him what happened. He was quiet for a minute before he said my mother's behavior reminded him of cases where parents enable their children so much they end up committing crimes to protect them. I laughed because that seemed extreme, but he didn't laugh back. He said he'd seen it before and I should be careful. Leah brought me coffee at work the next day and sat with me during our break. She said her cousin worked at the insurance company where my mother processed claims, and there'd been some kind of internal investigation going on. I didn't think much of it because my mother had worked there for years and seemed good at her job. Leah said her cousin couldn't give details, but the investigation was serious. I went back to work and tried not to worry about it, but my stomach felt tight all day. Detective Robertson called me 3 days later and asked if I could come down to the station. He said the insurance company had contacted police about potential fraud, and my mother's name had come up. My stomach dropped because I knew immediately that she must be involved somehow. I drove to the station after my shift ended, and Detective Robertson met me in the same interview room where we'd talked about Kevin's case. He looked tired and said he needed to ask me some questions about my mother's finances and recent behavior. The insurance company's investigator showed up 20 minutes later. Her name was printed on her business card, but I was too nervous to remember it. She asked about my mother's financial situation and whether she'd been under unusual stress lately. I was honest about Kevin's case and how my mother had been obsessed with protecting him no matter what it cost. I told her about the restraining order and the violation and all the crazy things my mother had done over the past few weeks. The investigator's face went serious and she exchanged a look with Detective Robertson. She explained they'd found problems in claims my mother had processed over the past 2 years. The total was over $30,000 in fake or inflated claims that shouldn't have been approved. I felt sick because I knew what that meant. My mother had been stealing from the insurance company, and now she was going to face charges just like Kevin. I met with Brandon the next day at his office because I didn't know what to do. I told him everything the investigator had said, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked if I wanted to protect my mother, or if I wanted to do the right thing. I said I didn't know because she was still my mother even after everything she'd done. Brandon pointed out that insurance fraud hurts real people who need their legitimate claims paid. He said while my mother was approving fake claims and taking money, real people were probably getting their claims denied because the company was losing money. That made me feel worse because I hadn't thought about it that way. The investigator had told Detective Robertson that my mother was part of a ring of people committing fraud. She'd been approving fake claims and splitting the money with the people who filed them. I felt sick knowing my mother had become a criminal just to fund Kevin's lifestyle and keep giving him money he didn't earn. Detective Robertson called me in for another interview a week later. This time he had printed emails and bank records spread across the table. He said my mother had been committing insurance fraud for almost 2 years, which meant it started long before Kevin got arrested for embezzlement. She'd been stealing money and giving it to Kevin to pay his debts and fund his drug habits. The investigation had found emails where my mother discussed doing whatever it takes to support Kevin and help him through his problems. I read some of the emails and they made me want to cry. My mother had written about how Kevin needed her and she'd do anything to protect him. She'd written about how I was strong enough to take care of myself, but Kevin wasn't. Detective Robertson said my mother's recent desperation to blame me for Kevin's crime wasn't just about that case. She'd been trying to hide her own crimes and probably panicked when Kevin got arrested because she knew investigators might start looking into her finances too. I had to make the hardest decision of my life over the next few days. Brandon explained that my testimony about my mother's recent behavior could help establish a pattern that would strengthen the case against her. But he said I didn't have to participate if I didn't want to. I could refuse to cooperate and let the investigators build their case without me. I thought about all the people whose legitimate insurance claims got denied while my mother funneled money to Kevin and his deadbeat friends. I thought about families who couldn't get their medical bills covered or their car accidents paid for because the insurance company was losing money to fraud. Brandon said the company had raised premiums for everyone to cover their losses, which meant regular people were paying more because of what my mother did. That's what made up my mind. I couldn't protect my mother when she'd hurt so many other people just to enable Kevin. I agreed to provide a statement about my mother's recent actions and her obsession with protecting Kevin no matter what it cost. The investigator came to Brandon's office so I'd feel more comfortable, and we spent 3 hours going through everything. I described how my mother had tried to get me to confess to Kevin's crime. I explained how she'd harassed me at work and called my professors and tried to destroy my reputation. And I talked about the restraining order and how she'd violated it 2 days later because she couldn't stop herself. During the interview, I broke down crying when I described how my mother had always chosen Kevin over me my entire life. I said she'd given him everything while making me work for scraps of her attention. Now she was going to prison because she couldn't stop enabling him even when it meant committing crimes herself. The investigator was kind, but she kept asking questions and taking notes. When we finished, I felt like I'd just betrayed my own mother, and I couldn't stop crying in Brandon's office for 20 minutes after the investigator left. My mother was arrested 2 weeks later for insurance fraud, embezzlement, and multiple restraining order violations. The news spread through our small town within hours because someone at the police station told someone at the grocery store, and it went from there. I got sympathetic looks when I went shopping that weekend, and people I barely knew came up to tell me they were sorry about my family situation. Kevin's public defender called me the day after my mother's arrest. He said Kevin was finally willing to take the plea deal the prosecutor had offered months ago. He sounded genuinely shaken when he told me Kevin hadn't realized our mother was committing crimes to support him. The defender said Kevin thought the money came from her salary and savings. Now Kevin understood the full scope of what had happened, and he wanted to take responsibility for his own actions instead of letting our mother sacrifice herself anymore. Kevin pleaded guilty to embezzlement at his hearing 2 weeks later. The judge sentenced him to 3 years probation with mandatory restitution payments to Coleman Electronics and required counseling for substance abuse. At the sentencing, Kevin actually turned to me in the courtroom and apologized in front of the judge and everyone else there. He said he'd let our mother enable him for too long and he was sorry for the role he played in destroying our family. He admitted he'd been a terrible brother and he understood why I couldn't protect him anymore. I didn't forgive him right then because I was still too angry and hurt, but I appreciated that he was finally taking responsibility instead of hiding behind our mother and letting her fight his battles. The judge seemed surprised by Kevin's apology and said it showed genuine remorse. He told Kevin that accepting responsibility was the first step toward actually changing his life. My mother's trial happened 2 months later, and I sat in the back of the courtroom for the whole thing. The evidence against her was overwhelming because the insurance company had everything documented. They had the fake claims she'd approved with her supervisor code. They had bank records showing deposits that matched the amounts of fraudulent claims. They had emails between my mother and the people running the fraud ring where they discussed splitting money and covering their tracks. Her defense attorney argued she was driven by maternal instinct and made poor choices because she loved her son too much. But the prosecutor showed that the fraud started years ago and funded not just Kevin's basic needs but his drug habits and gambling debts. The prosecutor had records proving my mother gave Kevin thousands of dollars that he used to buy drugs and pay off dealers. Watching my mother sit at the defense table looking small and defeated, I felt grief for the mother I wished I'd had instead of anger at the one I got. She'd destroyed her own life trying to save Kevin, and now we were all paying the price for her choices. The jury found my mother guilty on all counts after just 3 hours of thinking about it. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later, and I marked the date on my calendar at work with a pen that shook in my hand. When the day came, I put on the black dress I wore to job interviews and drove to the courthouse an hour early because I couldn't sit still at home anymore. The courtroom was mostly empty except for the prosecutor and my mother's lawyer and a few people from the insurance company she'd stolen from. My mother came in wearing an orange jumpsuit with her hands cuffed in front of her, and she looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen her. She sat at the defense table and stared straight ahead while her lawyer whispered something to her. The judge came in, and everyone stood up and then sat back down, and I realized my hands were gripping the bench so hard my knuckles were white. The prosecutor talked about how my mother had stolen over $30,000 and violated a restraining order multiple times and showed no sign of understanding what she'd done wrong. My mother's lawyer said she was a woman who loved her son too much and made terrible choices because of that love. The judge looked at my mother and asked if she had anything to say. My mother stood up slowly, and for a second I thought she might finally apologize or show some kind of understanding. Instead, she said she did what any mother would do and she'd do it again if it meant protecting her child. The judge's face got hard, and he said that wasn't remorse. That was a statement of intent to keep breaking the law. He sentenced her to 4 years in state prison with full restitution to the insurance company and all the people whose claims were denied because of her fraud. My mother didn't react at all when he said 4 years. She just stood there like a statue while the bailiff came to take her back. As they led her past my row, she finally looked at me, and her eyes were completely empty, like she didn't even recognize me as her daughter anymore. I sat there after everyone left, and then I went to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall and cried until my throat hurt, because my family was completely broken now, and there was no fixing it. I called a therapist the next week because I couldn't sleep, and when I did sleep, I had dreams about my mother screaming at me. The therapist's office was in a small building near the hospital, and the waiting room had magazines about gardening and soft music playing. The therapist asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started talking and couldn't stop for almost the whole hour. She listened and took notes, and when I finished, she said the most important thing I needed to understand was that I didn't cause any of this. She said my mother's choices were her own, and the problems in our family went back years before Kevin's arrest. Over the next few months, I went every Tuesday after my shift, and we talked about how my mother had always chosen Kevin over me, and how I'd spent my whole life trying to earn love from someone who couldn't give it. The therapist helped me see that my mother's enabling of Kevin wasn't really about love at all, but about her own need to feel important and needed. She said I was working through complicated grief for a relationship I never actually had and might never have. Some sessions I cried the whole time, and some sessions I just sat there feeling numb. But slowly I started to feel less like I was drowning, and more like I could breathe again. 3 months after the sentencing, I got a letter forwarded from my old address. The return address said it was from Kevin at a place called Riverside Sober Living. I almost threw it away without opening it, but something made me sit down at my kitchen table and tear the envelope open. The letter was 2 pages long in Kevin's messy handwriting. He wrote that he was working full-time at a warehouse loading trucks and going to meetings every night and living with other guys who were trying to stay clean. He said watching our mother go to prison for enabling him was the hardest thing he'd ever seen, and it finally made him understand what he'd been doing to our family. He wrote that he was sorry for his role in destroying everything, and he knew sorry wasn't enough, but he wanted me to know he was trying to change. He said he understood if I never wanted to talk to him again, but he hoped someday I might be willing to give him a chance to be a real brother. I read the letter 3 times, and then I put it in my desk drawer and didn't look at it for a week. Finally, I wrote back a short note saying I needed time, but I was glad he was getting help, and I hoped he kept going to his meetings. I didn't promise anything, but I also didn't shut the door completely. 6 months after everything fell apart, I got promoted to senior technician at the hospital with a raise that meant I could finally stop working doubles. I finished my bachelor's degree in May, and Leah and Brandon came to the small graduation ceremony and took me out for dinner after. Kevin and I had been emailing back and forth every few weeks, and he'd kept his job and stayed sober, and even started taking classes at community college. I had cautious hope that maybe he was actually changing this time. My mother was in prison and would be for years, and I'd accepted that our relationship might never be fixed. Some days I felt angry at her, and some days I just felt sad for both of us. But I was building a life that wasn't about trying to earn love from people who couldn't give it. I had friends who actually showed up for me and a job I was good at, and a future that belonged to me. I was stronger for surviving everything that happened, but I still carried the sadness of losing my family. I knew it was necessary for my own survival, but that didn't make it hurt less. I was learning to live with both things at once, the strength and the sadness, and maybe that was what growing up actually meant.